The terminal was alive with the organized chaos of an early morning departure. Rolling suitcases clicked against the polished floor. Muffled boarding announcements echoed through the high ceilings, and the faint aroma of freshly brewed airport coffee drifted from a nearby kiosk. Through the glass walls of Gate C12, the sleek fuselage of Flight 482 gleamed in the soft light of sunrise. Its silver skin reflected streaks of pink and gold, promising another long-haul journey across the Atlantic. Among the steady stream of passengers scanning boarding passes and stepping down the jet bridge was Dr. Naomi Carter. In her mid-40s, Naomi carried herself with a calm, self-assured elegance. She wore a tailored navy pantsuit, crisp white blouse, and low black heels. Practical, professional, and quietly refined. Over her arm was a charcoal wool coat, and in her right hand she held a slim, weathered leather briefcase. Her eyes, intelligent and observant, moved over the cabin interior as she stepped aboard, taking in the subtle details most passengers overlooked. The faint hum of the air filtration system, the positioning of the emergency lighting strips along the aisle, even the exact angle of the crew's pre-boarding smiles. A smiling attendant at the door, not the one she would soon have trouble with, checked her boarding stub and gestured toward the first row of business class. Naomi thanked her softly and made her way forward. Row 1, Seat 1. A. A wide window seat with extra legroom, a polished console, and a neatly folded blanket perched on the armrest. She set her briefcase under the seat in front, hung her coat neatly on the hook, and settled into her chair with the quiet efficiency of someone who had flown hundreds of times before. Around her, the atmosphere in business class was hushed, punctuated by the low murmur of conversation and the gentle rustle of newspapers. A man in a tailored suit across the aisle sipped orange juice, glancing at his phone. A young couple nearby discussed their itinerary in hushed tones. Naomi folded her hands loosely in her lap, her gaze drifting briefly to the jet bridge outside the window. She wasn't here for a holiday. This trip, like many others before it, had a purpose, one that she would keep to herself until the right moment. As she sat there composed and unassuming, she had no idea that the woman who would soon walk toward her, a flight attendant named Lydia Marsh, was already scanning the cabin and forming her own assumptions. Assumptions that would change the course of this flight. The final waves of passengers were boarding, and the cabin of Flight 482 was beginning to settle into that brief lull before the overhead bins clicked shut. The faint scent of jet fuel from the open door mixed with the perfume and cologne of travelers passing down the aisle. Lydia Marsh, one of the senior flight attendants on duty, stood at the forward galley with a polished clipboard in her hand. At 32, she had the immaculate grooming and quick, efficient manner that passengers often associated with experience. Her blonde hair was swept into a precise bun, her uniform perfectly pressed, and her lipstick an exact airline-approved shade of crimson. She scanned the seating chart, her eyes automatically flicking between seat numbers and the passengers occupying them. Lydia prided herself on keeping the business class section orderly, a space for the right kind of travelers, as she privately thought of it. It was during one of these routine sweeps that she noticed Naomi Carter in seat 1A. The woman was neatly dressed, yes, but her clothes were understated. A navy pantsuit without flashy accessories, sensible heels, no designer handbag resting beside her. The leather briefcase at her feet was old, its corners softened by years of use. Naomi's posture was relaxed, but not deferential. She gazed calmly out the window, seemingly oblivious to the subtle undercurrents of hierarchy that Lydia felt defined this part of the cabin. Lydia's eyes lingered a moment too long. Strange, she thought. I don't remember seeing her in the priority boarding group. Did she slip in from economy? Her mind began filling in the blanks with quiet, unchallenged assumptions. Maybe this passenger had been mistakenly assigned a business class seat. Maybe she'd used miles or a last-minute upgrade, the kind of thing that sometimes resulted in seat shuffling before departure. And maybe, Lydia told herself, it would be best to move her now before the real seat occupant arrived. It would avoid an awkward scene later. From the galley, Lydia stepped into the aisle, her heels clicking softly against the carpet. She glanced at the man in 1B, a corporate type with noise-canceling headphones, then back to Naomi. Her expression was pleasant but faintly patronizing. the kind of smile someone wears when they believe they're about to correct a small mistake. She rehearsed the words in her head. "Excuse me, ma'am, I believe there's been a seating error." Lydia didn't know it yet, but the conversation she was about to start would be the first step toward one of the most uncomfortable realizations of her career. The seatbelt sign above the aisle still glowed dimly, though boarding was nearly complete. Naomi Carter sat quietly in 1A, her gaze on the tarmac outside, where baggage handlers in neon vests moved briskly in the morning chill. She was listening to the faint hum of the aircraft's ventilation system, a sound she knew better than most, when the shadow of a flight attendant fell across her. "Excuse me, ma'am," Lydia Marsh began, leaning slightly toward Naomi's seat. Her voice carried the brightness of customer service, but beneath it was the clipped efficiency of someone delivering instructions rather than extending choices. Naomi turned her head, her expression calm. "Yes?" Lydia kept her smile in place. "I believe there's been a small seating mix-up. This row is reserved for certain passengers, and we'll need you to move to a seat toward the back of the aircraft. If you'll just gather your belongings, I can escort you." The man in 1B half listened, his eyes flicking toward them for a moment before returning to his tablet. Naomi, however, stayed still. She studied Lydia for a beat, her dark eyes steady and unhurried. "This is my assigned seat," she said evenly. 1A. "Yes, well," Lydia replied, her tone tightening just slightly. "Sometimes seat assignments are adjusted for operational reasons. You'll be much more comfortable in the seat I'll provide for you." She gestured vaguely toward the economy cabin behind the curtain, where the chatter and rustle of passengers finding their seats was still ongoing. Naomi's hands rested on the armrests, fingers relaxed. "More comfortable than here?" she asked, her tone polite, but tinged with quiet incredulity. Lydia didn't answer directly. "It's just, these seats are generally reserved for premium or priority status travelers," she said, as if explaining something obvious. "I'm sure you understand." From a few rows back, a man in a gray sweater looked up, sensing the undertone in Lydia's words. He frowned slightly, his gaze shifting between the two women. Naomi felt the weight of several nearby passengers' eyes on her, but her expression remained composed. "I boarded with a valid boarding pass for this seat. If there's a problem, I'd like to see the passenger manifest." Lydia blinked, unused to pushback couched in such calm authority. "Hey, ma'am, I'm trying to avoid any inconvenience. It will be easier for everyone if you just—" Naomi's lips curved faintly, almost in a smile, though her eyes did not soften. "Easier for whom?" she asked quietly. The question hung in the air for a moment too long. Lydia's cheeks flushed slightly, and she straightened her posture. "Please gather your things," she said, her voice returning to the rehearsed brightness of customer service. After a brief pause, Naomi exhaled slowly, reached for her coat, and slid her briefcase out from under the seat. Without a word, she rose to her feet. The aisle seemed to narrow as she began the slow walk toward the back of the aircraft, the quiet murmurs of onlookers trailing behind her like an invisible wake. The aisle of Flight 482 was narrow, lined with polished metal edges and overhead bins that clicked softly as late passengers stowed their carry-ons. Naomi Carter walked slowly down its length, her coat draped neatly over one arm, her briefcase in her other hand. She moved with a kind of deliberate composure, each step measured, her head held level, her shoulders square. The hum of conversation in the cabin dipped noticeably as she passed. In business class, a few passengers glanced over the rims of their glasses or peered up from their newspapers. Their eyes followed her until the curtain dividing the sections swayed shut behind her. In economy, the environment was different, warmer in temperature, closer in proximity. The air was tinged with the scent of coffee from a galley pot and the faint trace of someone's breakfast sandwich. A mother soothed a fussy toddler in row 14. Two college-age travelers compared boarding passes over the armrest in row 18. Lydia Marsh followed a few steps behind, her heels clicking briskly on the carpet runner. She scanned the rows with a practiced eye before pointing toward the very back of the plane. "Right there, ma'am," she said in her bright, clipped tone, gesturing to an empty window seat in row 32. Naomi set her briefcase carefully under the seat in front of her, hung her coat neatly on the hook, and lowered herself into the narrow seat. The cushioning here was thinner, the armrests closer together. The seat in front of her already bore the scuffs and faint scratches of heavy use. Around her, a few passengers looked up briefly before returning to their books or phones. Only one, an older man across the aisle, watched her for a few moments longer, his expression one of mild curiosity and faint disapproval of how she'd ended up there. Naomi adjusted her seatbelt and rested her hands in her lap. Her gaze drifted to the oval window, where the airport tarmac shimmered in the pale morning light. If anyone had expected her to show visible frustration or protest, they would have been disappointed. Lydia gave a small nod, as if to signal the matter was settled, and turned back toward the front of the aircraft. She disappeared through the curtain into business class, where the hum of low voices resumed. From her seat in the very last row, Naomi's view of the cabin was unbroken. She could see every seat, every passenger, every movement of the crew. She sat in silence, her mind already noting the details she would later recall with precision. The aircraft had leveled off above the cloud line, its engines purring with a steady, reassuring vibration. Through the windows, the world below was hidden beneath a vast quilt of white, the horizon a pale ribbon where sky met the Earth's curve. In the cabin, the seatbelt sign had just clicked off with a soft chime. Passengers reached for laptops, books, and meal trays as the crew began their service. From her seat in row 32, Naomi Carter calmly accepted a small cup of water from a junior flight attendant, offering a polite smile in return. Up at the front of the aircraft, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Deep, confident, carrying the practiced warmth of someone who'd spent decades addressing passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "on behalf of our crew, I'd like to welcome you aboard Flight 482. We're currently cruising at 35,000 feet and will be arriving on schedule at our destination." There was the expected pause, a few passengers glancing up briefly before returning to their tasks. Then his tone shifted just slightly, still casual, but with a note of importance. "We also have the privilege of carrying a special guest with us today, a representative from the airline's Internal Operations Department. Dr. Naomi Carter's on board, conducting an unscheduled evaluation of our service and safety standards." The words rippled through the cabin. Several heads turned instinctively, scanning the rows for anyone who might fit the description. In business class, Lydia Marsh, halfway through pouring sparkling water for a passenger in 1B, froze for a fraction of a second. The bottle tilted dangerously before she caught herself and set it upright on the tray. She replayed the name in her mind. Dr. Naomi Carter. It was unfamiliar, but the title and role were unmistakable. Airline's internal operations meant only one thing: someone high-ranking enough to observe, assess, and report directly to senior management. A slow, cold realization began to spread in Lydia's chest. She pictured the woman in the navy pantsuit with the worn leather briefcase, the one she'd just sent to the back of the aircraft, the one now sitting in a cramped economy seat while her original spot in 1A remained conspicuously empty. In the rows around Naomi, a few passengers exchanged curious looks. The older man across the aisle from her smiled faintly, as if he'd already guessed there was more to her than met the eye. Naomi herself remained composed, her gaze still on the clouds drifting far below. If she'd heard the announcement, and she certainly had, she gave no outward sign. Only her left hand moved slightly, adjusting the leather strap of her briefcase, as though preparing for the part of the flight that would matter most. The cabin lights had dimmed slightly as the flight moved into its steady cruise. Meal trays clinked and the low murmur of conversation filled the space, but for Lydia Marsh, every sound felt distant. She was too aware of the fact that somewhere in row 32 sat the Dr. Naomi Carter the captain had announced, and that she had personally relegated her there. At 35,000 feet, there was nowhere to walk away, nowhere to hide behind procedure. Lydia's pulse thudded in her ears as she glanced toward the back of the plane. Naomi was there, exactly as before, poised and composed, sipping her water. She seemed to notice Lydia's glance, but didn't return it. A chime sounded over the intercom. One of the junior flight attendants leaned into Lydia's ear and murmured, "She asked to speak with the lead crew member. Said now would be a good time." For a split second, Lydia considered sending another attendant. But she knew, and something in Naomi's quiet presence made it clear, that this was a conversation she couldn't delegate. She made the walk down the aisle slowly, every step feeling longer than the last. Passengers' eyes tracked her, their expressions unreadable. When she reached the last row, Naomi set down her cup and arose smoothly to her feet. Up close, Lydia noticed details she'd overlooked before. The precision of Naomi's posture, the steady weight in her gaze, the way her presence seemed to fill the narrow space without any need for raised voice or sharp tone. "Doctor? Carter?" Lydia said softly, her voice carefully modulated. Naomi inclined her head. "Yes. I thought it would be best to introduce myself in person before I finish my assessment." She gestured toward the aisle, inviting Lydia to lead the way. As they began walking forward together, passengers in both economy and business class turned to watch. The quiet murmur of voices followed them, like a tide rising behind their steps. When they reached the galley at the front, Naomi stopped just inside the business class section. She turned, so her voice would carry clearly to the crew and to the nearest passengers who were still watching. "For the record," she said, her tone even but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone used to commanding rooms, "I am the airline's lead safety and service inspector. My evaluations cover everything from pre-flight safety protocols to how passengers are treated in all classes of service. Every interaction matters." Lydia's face felt hot. She stood a half step behind Naomi, her hands clasped too tightly in front of her. Naomi looked directly at her, including whether a passenger is respected enough to remain in the seat they were assigned. The words weren't loud, but the weight of them was undeniable. Lydia opened her mouth, searching for an explanation, but Naomi's calm gaze held her still. There was no anger in it, just a clarity that made excuses pointless. Several passengers exchanged glances. One man in 1B shifted uncomfortably in his seat. A woman 2 rows back whispered something to her travel companion, eyes wide. Naomi finally stepped aside, her voice softening. "I'll return to my seat now. You may proceed with service." And with that, she walked past Lydia toward the curtain, not to row 32, but to the still empty 1A. She sat, placed her briefcase neatly at her feet, and looked out the window as though the matter were settled. For Naomi, it was. For Lydia, it was far from over. The final descent into the destination city had begun. The cabin lights brightened gradually, mimicking sunrise, and the crew moved through their final checks with mechanical precision. Through the windows, the patchwork of fields and winding rivers below grew clearer as the aircraft cut smoothly through a thin veil of cloud. In 1A, Naomi Carter secured her briefcase, fastened her seatbelt, and watched the ground draw closer. She could feel the subtle changes in engine pitch, the familiar tilt of the nose as the plane followed its glide path. She'd done this hundreds of times before, but this landing felt heavier, not because of the flight itself, but because of the lesson it would leave behind. As soon as the aircraft rolled to a stop at the gate and the chime released passengers from their seats, the aisles filled with the rustle of coats, the thud of carry-ons being pulled from overhead bins, and the low murmur of goodbyes. Lydia Marsh, standing at the front near the open door, greeted departing passengers with her usual practiced smile. But it faltered each time she caught sight of Naomi still seated, waiting for the crowd to thin. When the last of the business class passengers had stepped off, Naomi rose with quiet poise, slipping her coat over her shoulders. She walked toward the exit, her polished heels making soft, deliberate sounds against the carpet. "Doctor." "Carter," Lydia began, her voice low but urgent. She took a small step closer. "I wanted to apologize. I shouldn't have asked you to move. I misjudged the situation, and I'm truly sorry." Naomi paused just before the jet bridge, turning to face her. The noise of passengers spilling into the terminal filled the background, but her gaze locked firmly on Lydia's. "I appreciate the apology," Naomi said, her voice calm but carrying a weight that made Lydia's chest tighten. "But understand this. I don't need your respect because of my title. Every passenger who steps on this plane deserves to be treated with dignity, no matter where they sit, how they look, or what you assume about them." Lydia swallowed, the words sinking in with an uncomfortable finality. Naomi's expression softened just slightly. "The uniform you wear carries trust. The moment you make assumptions, you chip away at that trust. and it's hard to earn back. She held Lydia's gaze for one last moment, then turned and walked down the jet bridge, her coat catching the soft morning light from the terminal windows. Her steps were steady, unhurried, and impossibly composed. Lydia stood at the doorway long after Naomi had vanished into the crowd, the weight of the exchange settling into her bones. Around her, the crew continued their post-flight duties, but for her, the flight wasn't over, not in the way that mattered. Naomi's words would travel with her, echoing each time she scanned a boarding pass or looked at a passenger a beat too long. And perhaps, Lydia thought, that was the real inspection she had failed.